Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Rasoul. Thank you for joining us today.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I just want to tell our audience a little bit about you. You are an incredible author. You've written in multiple different languages. You're a contributing writer to Imam as well. You are an adjunct professor at George Washington University, running the Mufid Seminary, which is the first MA study program in the U.S. And you're also the resident alim at Khatam Nabiyeen, where you're doing incredible work. MashaAllah, thank you for all your services you're providing to the community in Virginia and beyond. The first question I have for you is, where do we usually go to when we want to study hadith?
So in brief, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in brief I can say, like, one of the most general sources that we refer to is Kutub al Arbah, that we can talk in detail about it. But before going there, I want to say one thing, like kind of an introduction, that what do we mean by we referring to a hadith? Because referring to hadith and opening a book of hadith and trying to find Islamic law and acting upon it is not our work. It's basically not possible as an ordinary person who didn't study the Ilm al Hadith, the science of hadith, to actually go open a book and say, hey, this is the Islamic law. That's not how it's going to work, because our books of ahadith are full of contradictory ahadith, are full of ahadith which the general idea is in one hadith and the exception is in another hadith. And it's not easy to distinguish between the sahih hadith, correct hadith, legitimate hadith, and the fake one, fabricated one. So when we say we want to refer to the books of hadith, we need to be cautious, because yes, it's good to refer to know about it, but it's not good for an ordinary person to refer to a hadith and say this is the Islamic law, because it's just the job of an expert. It would be like me, who has no idea about like eye surgery, to go and open a book about eye surgery and say, this is the correct opinion and I have to follow it. That's not a professional work. That's not how a professional person acts. You are expert in one thing and people are expert in one other
thing. So you
thing.
need to have some sort of a base level of knowledge about what the hadiths are and some sort of understanding to even get into it.
Exactly. But even basic knowledge is good for many people. Are curious, like how our maraja end up saying that this is the Islamic law. It's very good to know about the background, right? How they came to this law, it's a very good question that everyone can ask. Other than that, well, I think if you're not referring to the ahadith for the Islamic law, and you're referring to the ahadith to know some of the adab, some of the etiquettes, some of the mustahabbat,
or even history.
Exactly. Yeah. So for this purpose, I think it's fine for everyone to study hadith. So it's actually very good. It's eye-opening to know all of the background of all of our ahkam that we have. So just we need to know that it's not it's not the perfect scenario to open the Usul al-Kafi and say, hey, this is the Islamic law, let's act upon it.
Basically, right? I just can't take the Shahada one day and next day open up Usul al-Kafi, basically.
Yeah. And it's not like we say it is haram to do so. No, it's of course not. It's just not professional work. Yeah.
There's a chance of you getting the wrong answer, or getting a misconception about something than you coming to the right resolution, right?
Exactly. So be cautious until you study enough that you feel comfortable saying something. So
you have to have some sort of a level of knowledge to even jump into the topic of hadith and examine it. Why is hadith so important?
Oh yeah, hadith is actually very important in for many different reasons. So one of the reasons that hadith is very important is that it helps you to understand the meaning of Quran better. So because like Quran was revealed like about 14 centuries ago, and if you know what was the understanding of the people during the time of the revelation of Quran, or the people who were close to that period, it actually helps you in the ilm of tafsir. It helps you to know how you should interpret this ayah. That's one of the reasons that hadith is really important. So it helps us to understand Quran. And the other reason is that it actually helps us to follow Quran, in the sense that Quran in many different verses. So for example, in one verse says, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُ. Whatever Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam gave to you, take it. So now the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the ahkam in his wording, in his actions, right? So if you know and the only one of the main, not the only, one of the main ways that we get access to the sayings of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his manners is through the ilm of hadith. So that's the other reason. We in another Quran, in another verse, we have لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, that in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam there is a perfect example for you. So in Quran it has been mentioned, but in hadith there are many more about the seerah of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's another reason. And I don't know if you have heard or not, but there are many different, like there has been a tradition in Muslim countries to sit down and memorize 40 hadiths.
I was just gonna say that there's this style of like brothers all over the world just memorize hadith, and I've never been able to get myself to that level just yet, but I'm always impressed by people who are just able to recite hadith.
Yeah, exactly. So they memorize it. Like the memorization and is a big part of our tradition. You know, our tradition before becoming a written tradition, it was totally an oral tradition, and in an oral tradition memorization plays a big factor. Absolutely. Right? So that's why you, when you go to our history, you see how important it is to memorize, and still you see the remaining of that tradition in our Sunday schools, that parents are interested to learn about, for their kids to memorize Quran, to memorize hadith. So you have all of these ahadith which says it is mustahab to memorize for the hadith, mustahab to write for the hadith, mustahab to explain for the hadith, and that's why you have you see many of our scholars have 40 hadith book, and that's how I think we can talk about why this hadith is important. That's the living tradition that explains Quran, brings Quran to an action, because Quran was a written document that was lived with it through different centuries, and it is the hadith which tells you how Quran was played in different centuries, how Quran was lived with in different centuries.
So somebody like me who hasn't, doesn't have the best of memories, how can I start by start memorizing my 40 hadiths? Like, what's my first step?
I would say just pick up the right book. I wouldn't recommend like the book of hadith which are regarding Islamic law. I would recommend more books like Tuhaf al-Uqul, which is more about akhlaq and sirah, or I would go to the last part of Nahj al-Balagha, which has very short sayings and actually very wise and beautiful sayings of Imam Ali alayhi salam, and just take it and act upon it and memorize it. Beautiful, wise, short sayings.
That's wonderful. So far, we know what we know the hadith, the importance of hadith. We know that it basically tells us, you can get a better picture of what the Quran is all about, get a deeper message from the Quran itself. It also provides a context to history, provides a context of the Quran. And because this is so important, not everybody can just go right into it and study hadith, right? So what are some of our books that we refer to, or people like yourself, people that are learned, refer to for hadith to decide on aqaid and things like that? I've always heard this name, Kutub al Arbah. Tell us a little bit about that.
And the phrase Kutub al Arbah means 4 books, and it is the process of compiling the ahadith of our A'imma alayhimus salam that after the first 2 centuries, eventually the scholars of hadith started to get together to get these ahadith together and put it in one book. The first one being Usul al-Kafi, right? So that is actually written during the time of Ghaiba, the Ghaibat al-Sughra, during the time of the Ghaiba of Imam al-Zaman Ajallahu Ta'ala Farajur Sharif, and in about the beginning of the 10th century. And so what's happening there is that you see these 4 books eventually becomes the main books. And what are these 4 books, and where the phrase Kutub al Arbah come from? The phrase Kutub al Arbah comes from a letter that Zainuddin Amili is a great scholar. He was living in the 16th century, and he lived in a very diverse context, that for him to be a jurist, he needed to know not only the Jafari school, but also the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i. Yeah. So all of these 5 different schools, right? And it's very interesting and fascinating that this jurist, like Zainuddin al-Amili, who he's able to teach 5 different mazahib at the same time. So this jurist comes, and see how beautiful it is. We now sit down and we think that our jurists in the Sunni and Shia tradition, they were not in contact with each other. And now this is Zainuddin al-Amili. He lived in the 16th century. He is teaching, and probably most of his students are Sunni students, and there is no hesitation.
Was he in Iran or?
So he's from Amal, Jabal al-Amal, in today in Lebanon. And so what's interesting there is that his main book, which is Al-Lum'a ad-Damashqiyya, becomes, and still is, the first and the main book of Islamic law that people who go to seminary school study it. So what I'm trying to say is that's the phrase Kutub al Arbah comes from. He's the first one who uses this this phrase. So by Kutub al Arbah, he and then eventually everyone else in the Shia tradition refers to these 4 books. So the first one is written by Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Kulayni, who lived in the 10th century or the 4th century Hijri, and the book is called Kitab al-Kafi, and the book has about 16,000 ahadith. That's number 1, and we can talk about in detail about the book. Number 2 is by Ibn Babawai, which is Muhammad ibn Babawai, and the name of the book is Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih, and again we can talk about the book in detail. This book has about 9,000 hadiths. The other one, the third book, is called Al-Istibsar. Al-Istibsar has about 5,500 books by Sheikh Tusi, and the last one is Tahzib by Sheikh Tusi, which has about 13,500 hadith. So this is the main, or probably the most authentic books in the Shiite tradition.
So all combined, you're looking at about over 30,000, well over 30,000 hadiths, basically.
Yes. But again, it's not all of the hadiths that we have.
No, I mean, we have other works like Bihar al-Anwar, and there's so many other books. And like you mentioned earlier, there's 40 hadiths. All our ulama are putting those out all the time. So,
but many of the other ahadiths that we have, it was different categorization. So for example, one book went by sectioning the ahadith in one way and categorizing it in one way. Another book went in another way. So it's not that to say Bihar al-Anwar has ahadith that are not mentioned in even these 4 books have a lot of common ahadith. even these four.
That's what I was going to ask you. My next question was going to be, so if I go look at Al-Kafi, if I look at one hadith, is that hadith, I know Al-Kafi is divided, and we'll get into this in a little bit.
Yeah, we can talk.
So Al-Kafi is divided into many different sections. Am I going to see one hadith in one place and then in one section, and I can see the same hadith in a different section? So basically, are those 16,000 hadiths repetitive, or are they all individual different hadiths?
No. Some of them are repetitive. Some of them have been repeated in different sections of the book, but that's not normal. Yeah, like it happens rarely, but it's not it's not common.
So there's only a few hadiths that are like that, but mostly it's all individual hadiths.
Yeah, I didn't do a study on to find what were the hadiths which was repeated, but yes, it is not rare. But what I'm saying is that yes, you can find hadiths which are repeated.
You kind of touched on Al-Kafi a little bit. Tell me a little bit about the sections that we discussed. What are some of the sections that Al-Kafi is divided into?
So Al-Kafi has 3 different sections. The first section, which is Usul al-Kafi, that many of us have heard of, talks about like aqaid, theology, creed, and the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it has different sections on aqaid. That's usul al-kafi. And then you have the furu' al-kafi, and the furu' al-kafi mostly talks about Islamic law, different sections of Islamic law, like that are mostly our jurists and fuqaha refer to. And the third part is Rawda, which talks about communal living, talks about the principles of akhlaq, talks about the etiquettes. So I think for us, like, it makes a lot of sense to, if we want to study it, go from the Rawda, which is the last part of Al-Kafi, to kind of taste the water and
just dipping your feet into the
exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Before we move into Istibsar and the other books, on Al-Kafi, you mentioned this was kind of developed in the 10th century during Ghaibat al-Sughra. Is there some correlation? Like, did Imam during Ghaibat al-Sughra have something to do with the development of Al-Kafi, or is it just like, did a copy ever go to him?
Well, that's a very good question, and actually there are some of our scholars who believe that Imam Ajalallah Ta'ala Farajul Sharif said Al-Kafi Kafan li Shi'atina, meaning that this book is enough for our Shia, and if they refer, of course, to it and understand it and act upon it, that's enough. So yes, some of our scholars have said that, but of course that doesn't mean, like, there is a huge discussion of that. Does that mean that all of the hadith there is authentic? And most of the scholars now, at least, the common idea between our scholars is that no, that does not mean that all of the hadith in Al-Kafi is authentic.
People get misunderstood that just because we have these Kutub al Arbah or we have Al-Kafi, and you mentioned the hadith from the Imam saying that Kafi is enough, that doesn't, and you kind of touched on it too, Kafi, that doesn't mean that every single hadith in the book is Sahih. So our Sunni brothers and sisters, they have Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari. Those have, in the entirety of the book, has hujjah on them. That doesn't mean Al-Kafi has, all of Al-Kafi has hujjah on us. Am I correct on that?
Well, yes and no, because even in the Sunni tradition, there are scholars who say no. In the in the Sahih Sitta, there are ahadith which are fabricated. There are ahadith which are weak, and they don't rely on everything which is in the book. There are some of the scholars in the Sunni tradition who say whatever is in the Sahih Sitta, all of them are authentic. We take all of them. Even in the Shiite tradition, that exists. The same idea exists, that whatever is in these books, so the Akhbari tradition in our school refers to these books as the authentic ahadith that our scholars gather together, and they don't question any of the ahadith. But that's not the common idea in the
Which
Shia
is the
tradition.
Usuli tradition.
Exactly.
That's where we don't. Okay.
Exactly. So
Understood.
to our contemporary, I mean, especially our contemporary scholars, they don't go with the book, they go with the criteria. And we can talk about the criteria.
Perfect. So, and the next book is that you mentioned is Istibsar. So, tell me a little bit about.
So istibsar, basically istibsar, let me tell you the istibsar and man la yahdor in together. So istibsar is that what the author, he starts writing in the 11th century, and so Sheikh Tusi, what he wants to do in al-istibsar fi makhtalifa min al-akhbar is that he wants to bring these different contradictory ahadith of one subject all together. So for example, the very basic question of whether we are allowed to eat the slaughtered animal by an animal which is slaughtered by a person who is not Muslim, right? Yep. So there are ahadith which says yes, there are ahadith which says no, and so what he and among these two groups there are authentic and there are weak. Right. What he does is that he first mentions the more authentic ahadith in his idea, and then he mentions the weak ahadith, and then toward the end he says, well, I mean, when he goes to the other group which are contradicting ahadith, right? Yeah. So first mentioning the ahadith which says yes, second mentioning the ahadith which says no, and then in the third step he comes and says, okay, how we can actually reconcile these ahadith, which is the expertise of Sheikh Tusi, right? That's why I'm saying that it's an expert work. It's a professional work. So
he's taking the Sahih hadith.
Yeah.
He's taking the hadiths that basically are not Sahih, and then he's taking the hadiths that or sorry, let me start again.
No, you're right. So I think what you're trying to say is that so look, the contradictions that I'm referring to is not between a sahih and a weak hadith. No, the ahadith that are correct, the ahadith that based on our methodology are sahih and authentic, sometimes they contradict each other.
So a sahih that says yes and a sahih that says no, can they both be, they're just contradicting each other. They're both sahih, but they're just contradicting each other.
So what do you do here?
And then Sheikh Tusi just draws a conclusion from all of that.
Exactly.
MashaAllah, that's incredible. Has he classified the topics in the book or no?
Oh yeah, yes. Their books have different sections, and in each section that's what he do. So yeah.
And then his second book is Tahzib. What's the difference between Tahzib and Istibsar?
So Tahzib is just a longer version of the similar idea that you have it in Istibsar, and so these are the three by now. So we talked about Al-Kafi, we talked about Istibsar, and we talked about Tahzib. The last one, which is by Ibn Babawayh, is very interesting. So the last one is Man la yahduruhu al-faqih. Right? So man la yahduruhu al-faqih means the people who were not able to see a faqih, who were not able to sit down next to a faqih. Right? So he writes this book, and just imagine, he writes this book for mass audience there, right? And he writes it in a way that instead of writing his fatwas, he mentions the hadith. So if you're not able to ask a scholar, go and read this one. And what is interesting to me is that he's trying to avoid his own opinion and to say that this is my idea, right? He puts everything on the hadith and say, okay, this is the hadith. It seems that this is what the Islamic law is gonna be. So that's the whole idea of the hadith, and eventually it becomes not a book that everyone can refer to, because of, again, like he was thinking that this is everyone would be able to have access to, but it was way beyond the ordinary person and public.
And that's what I was going to say, right? So that kind of contradicts a little bit of what you were saying earlier, that we can't just jump right into it.
Yeah, he writes for this purpose.
Yeah.
But what happens is that he is not writing again for a person who doesn't know anything about the hadith. So I would say, I think he probably overestimated the people of his time, because I don't even think a person who didn't know anything about hadith, if he refers to this book, can get it.
Around?
So it is in the 10th century, around the same time as Sheikh Tusi, after Al-Kafi.
We've touched on our Kutub al Arbah. There are a lot of Sahih Sitta, our Sunni brothers and sisters have their own works of hadith that they follow. What's the difference?
Well, actually, the process is very similar. The process is very similar.
And that's the process of like categorizing a hadith. Basically.
Exactly. To find, I mean, they have different terms and different categories of hadith, but the process is either finding that this hadith against the book, or it's against the Quran, or it's not against Quran, if the chain of the hadith is an authentic chain or it's not. And so the process is very, very similar. The main difference, I would say, is that the Shiite tradition has a longer history of an authentic hadith, because we believe that the Sharia continued to be completed by our A'immah alayhimus salam. That's the main difference that you can find, but which basically gives the Shia school an access to more authentic
broader
hadith.
A broader access to like hadith.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That would be the main difference. But when it comes to finding which hadith is more authentic and which hadith is not authentic, the process is very similar.
So basically, a muhaddis who's going to sit down and find if a hadith is correct or not, it doesn't matter if he's Shia or Sunni, he's going to follow a very similar process. With slight variances on depending on the fiqh that he follows, but basically,
what I'm trying to say is that both jurists, whether he's in a Sunni tradition or in a Shia tradition, they are trying to find, is this hadith a hujjah, right, between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Got it.
Can I trust it or not? That's basically the basic question when you're going to the hadith.
You mentioned categorizing the hadith. How are we categorizing the hadith?
Oh, there are actually many different ways that we can categorize the hadith. But I would say there are two main ways that we can categorize the hadith. One is the way that we categorize the hadith based on the quality of the hadith, and then the other one would be on the quantity of the chain. So what do I mean by that? The quality of the hadith refers to finding out whether this hadith is a fake one or is not a fake one. Is it authentic or not? So there are three different major categorizations here. So in the Shia tradition, you find the Sahih hadith, which the chain of this hadith is a person who is imami, who is the follower of the Shi'i madhab, and thiqa, trustworthy. So if he is thiqa and imami, the hadith is called sahih.
I want to stop you for 1 second. Imami as in, does he have Ismaili, Zaydi, Isna Ashari, or anybody?
No. Here we are talking about the Isna Ashari tradition. And again, what I'm trying to say is that there are many different ways of hadith categorization, but this is the majority. This is the main way in the Isna Ashari tradition, that you have the if the rawi, if the narrator is thiqa, like trustworthy, and he is following the mazhab of Ja'fari mazhab, the hadith would be called sahih. The second one would be hadith al muwaththaq. Hadith al muwaththaq is when the narrator is not imami, but is trustworthy. So if he is following like another school of thought, like for example you have Ali ibn al-Faddal or you have Aban ibn Usman, these two great scholars, you find them being narrating a lot of ahadith in the Shia tradition, which our scholars accept those ahadith, but they don't call it a sahih hadith, they call it a muwaththaq hadith. That's the second category. And the third one is a da'if, which is a weak hadith, which is not authentic, which you don't refer to it, and that's a hadith that is not thiqa. It's like the person is not trustworthy. You can't trust this person by referring to Ilm al Rijal and studying Ilm al Rijal. So that's the one way of categorization of hadith, which refers to the quality of the hadith. Sahih. Yeah.
Before we move on to the other category, I just want to interrupt for 1 second and say, always had this in mind. Why don't we just throw out the hadiths that are da'if? Why keep them around?
That's part of our tradition. It's very interesting that the idea of which hadith is sahih, is da'if, and it's not, which hadith is not da'if, have been changing and improving through the century of Islamic law. So for example, a khabar al-wahid, a riwayah, a hadith which was narrated only by one person or one group of people, has been considered unauthentic and a weak hadith for many centuries. Eventually, that becomes a hadith that that our scholars rely on, and what happens is that all of a sudden many ahadith which have been categorized as da'if hadith or weak hadith becomes available to the fuqaha. Yep. So other than that, it's our tradition. Even a da'if hadith, even a fabricated hadith, it tells you about this story, a history. It tells you need to ask the question, why someone is making this lie, why this is important in that time. So it's telling.
It's basically an academic process, right?
Exactly.
You're not going to throw away something just. It's part of our history.
It's part of our history.
Yeah.
It's part of our history. Even if and people have different opinion on what is a da'if hadith and what is not a da'if hadith. So that was the first category of hadith, and the other one is the categorization of hadith based on the quantity of chain. So, for example, if a hadith, as we mentioned, khabar al-wahid, right? If a hadith is mentioned only by one chain or a very small group of people, so here they call it khabar al-wahid, which has just a certain amount of authenticity. The question is that, are we able to make exceptions by this kind of hadith, make exception to a verse of Quran, a general verse of Quran? Can this hadith make an exception for it or not? Right. So the other kind of hadith is that mutadafir. Mutadafir means a hadith which is a little bit, like it's not by one group, it's by several group of people, but still it is not to the level of being mutawatir, like many different people, many different narrators who were not in contact with each other, one from this area, this context, another from another context, that they are not able to basically get together and make something up. Yeah. So
that's mutazafir or
that's mutawatir. That's mutawatir. Mutawatir is that when a jurist becomes certain that this hadith is being narrated through many different chains, and these narrators were not able to get together and make up this hadith. That's a mutawatir hadith.
So basically, just to put it a little bit into context, that would be like me reporting something to you in Virginia, and then somebody else reporting something to somebody else in New York, then somebody else reporting something else in LA, and that happens in many different cities, and that's a mutawatir hadith.
Exactly, and it's to the point that there is no possibility of you guys being in contact with each other.
We don't know each other.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and how would I put that in context for mutazafir?
It's just very less. It's very less. It happens in three different, three, four, but it's not as like finding it everywhere in many, many different.
Sheikh Rasoul, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for enlightening us about the topic of hadith. Just to recap a little bit, you helped us out understand that hadith is not for the Ja'fari fiqh. It's not something that you can just jump right into. You need to have some sort of a base level of knowledge. But if you're trying to study history, if you're trying to study like some sort of akhlaq and things like that, there are hadiths which you told us about that you can kind of start memorizing or start delving into. Then you told us about the Kutub al Arbah, wonderful knowledge, a wonderful piece of knowledge that you shared with us. It's amazing to also learn about the different categories of hadith and the process that our ulama go through to just make sure that we are following the correct path. And thank you so much for putting us on the correct path on learning hadith. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.